recent book is called On Toleration. Michael Walzer is a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and the author of several books. Also co-editor of Dissent magazine and a contributing editor at the New Republic. He spoke at Barnes & Noble Booksellers in New York City.
If she was interested in toleration, he would bring her, but he sounded doubtful.
Ready to begin. Good evening. Welcome to Barnes & Noble. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Walzer, who is Institute Professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. He's also a co-editor with Mitchell Cohen, who might be in the audience or will be in the audience, of Dissent magazine, and a contributing editor to the New Republic. He has written many books, including Exodus and Revolution, Spheres of Justice, and Just and Unjust Wars, and that's only a few of the books. His current book that that he will talk about tonight is On Toleration. But I want to say something that I most admire about Michael Walzer's books is that when you read his work, you automatically engage in a conversation. If you read his work out loud, you realize that it's open-ended, and you are part of a dialogue with the work. And I think that that's a truly democratic way of writing, and it's my pleasure to introduce a democratic person, Michael Walzer.
Someone came up to me in Princeton yesterday and said they had heard that I was going to be reading from my new book. So I want to begin by assuring you that, or reassuring you, that I'm not going to be. Poets and novelists can read, but not political theorists. Our narrative line isn't strong enough for reading. I'll try instead to repeat a piece of the argument of the book, where I join the multiculturalism debate, the disuniting of America debate, and argue that the problems of our society don't derive from strong and divisive group identities, but from, or in part from, pervasive weakness. So that the most strident forms of political correctness, the more bizarre rewritings of history to bolster ethnic or racial pride, the efforts to use public schools to enforce group identification, all these signal the inability of groups to sustain themselves on their own in the more standard ways, the more liberal and democratic ways that society ought to offer them. Now, to understand this pervasive weakness, we need to consider the American regime of toleration. I mean, the political arrangements by which we accommodate difference. The American regime is something new in the world because it isn't groups that are tolerated in this country, but individuals. In the old multinational empires, by contrast, the imperial regime tolerated the different religious and ethnic communities, allowing them to form autonomous or semi-autonomous corporations, to run their own courts, to administer their own law, at least family law, as in the millet system of the old Ottoman Empire. In bi- and tri-national states, what political scientists call consociations, like Belgium or Switzerland or the stillborn Bosnia, the different communities tolerate each other, or are supposed to tolerate each other. In nation states, the national majority tolerates one or more national minorities, at least in decent nation states. But here, everybody has to tolerate everybody else. It's not just that a Protestant majority tolerates Catholics and Jews, but Catholics have to tolerate other Catholics who criticize the Pope or the bishop's stand on abortion, and Jews have to tolerate other Jews who choose to be Jewish in different ways, and similarly in all the other cases. American blacks are divided religiously and politically. There are 17 ways of being a feminist, and there's no one authentic way of being anything. So American groups have no corporate existence. They can't establish courts. They can't tax their members. They can't discipline wayward members. They can't police their boundaries. They are, in the strongest sense of the term, voluntary associations. The American regime, then, is the most intensive form of toleration, the most localized and particularized form of toleration in the political history of, I think, the world. But what it means is that all the groups are marked by very strong, vociferous, centrifugal tendencies, with individuals flying off in all directions or drifting in and out. The core is barely able to sustain itself. The core of militants or believers or activists is barely able to sustain itself. There isn't, in fact, a single core. There isn't a single identity as this or that, but rather individually inflected versions of thisness and thatness. And so the reproduction of cultural and religious differences across generations, which has always been the work of groups with their institutions and schools and ceremonies and rituals, is increasingly in doubt. The heroes of postmodernism, those men and women who construct their own identities, are real people, not mythic figures, as some of us thought. But they work from historically accumulated cultural materials, which they don't enhance and don't pass on. And so the constructions are likely to get thinner and thinner over time and to bring people together less and less cohesively. There are other reasons for group weakness in the United States. Above all, radical and growing inequality, which is, at least in part, group-marked, group-dependent, and which leaves some communities without the internal resources to sustain a strong collective life under modern conditions. And I hope we'll have a chance to talk about the effects of inequality on our regime of toleration in the discussion time. But I want to focus now on the regime itself and its practical consequence, which is to confirm the extreme individualism of American society. And then to pose a question. Do we really value the differences, the religious, cultural, and historical differences that we tolerate? Or is our kind of toleration simply a way of diffusing difference, pushing us toward a condition where individuals, all of us, will shape our identities out of roughly the same materials, the fragments of old cultures made universally available through the market and the media? If that happens, then toleration will cease to be a problem. Coexistence will become the subject of endless private melodramas, a matter of liking and disliking, not tolerating or not tolerating. It will cease to be a political question. There are people who look forward to that end point, when all of us are marginally different, but where the deep differences, which we have been taught to tolerate, which liberal regimes came so painfully to tolerate, have disappeared. But though I value the toleration of individual choice, and would defend it politically if it needed defending, I don't find those private melodramas a consummation devoutly to be wished. Choice, it seems to me, makes sense only within a framework where there are genuine options, deep differences. And options of that sort, differences of that sort, can only be collectively sustained. And so if there are to be objects of toleration, significant way of life differences that we encounter and have to deal with, then we have to find a way to support and strengthen group life and group institutions. I hope, again, that we'll have some time to talk about the ways in which that might be done in this country under the conditions of contemporary political conditions. All I want to argue now, and I want to conclude with this argument, is that strengthening group life doesn't have to disunite America. And if we do it in the right ways, it won't disunite America for three reasons, three interrelated reasons. So maybe it's only one reason, but three is the standard number for reasons. So, first, it's the weakest groups in this society that pursue the most extreme forms of identity politics. And it makes sense to expect that if we find ways to strengthen these groups so that they can accumulate resources and provide services for their members, they will be pulled into the more standard forms of democratic politics. Identity politics would then give way to what I want to call meat and potatoes multiculturalism. Meat and potatoes multiculturalism is meant to suggest, the term is meant to suggest a competition for interests rather than a struggle over what it means to be black or Jewish or a woman or... Secondly, our strongest groups don't try or are not able to monopolize the culture they defend. And so they don't constitute monolithic and battle-ready collectives. There are always, as I've said already, there are always rival versions of that culture, different ways of being whatever you think you are. Again, it's among people who feel vulnerable that the appeal of political correctness or religious or ethnic or racial orthodoxy is strongest, and where the appeal of don't break ranks is strongest, and the attack upon internal criticism and differentiation takes on fanatical tones. Groups that are confident about their capacity to survive across generations are more likely to tolerate disagreement here and now. Third, even if all the groups that make up American multiculturalism are strengthened, it will continue to be the case that most of us identify with more than one of them. That's a feature of immigrant societies. I think a general feature, though I know it best here. Immigrant societies are places where people are removed because they have removed themselves from their ancient homelands, and where the groups they belong to are geographically dispersed. So that multiculturalism here isn't a system of distinct coexisting and rivalrous groups, but because of commingling and intermarriage, it's a system or a non-system of composite associations, mixed families, and divided selves. The union that I belong to, the neighborhood I live in, the religious community or ethnic group that I identify with, the family I marry into, are all likely to be differently constituted. It's because of these individualizing differences that groups need to be strengthened. And it is also, this is not a paradox, but a piece of social logic, it's also because of those individualizing differences that strengthening groups won't be dangerous. Here. I don't mean that it won't make sometimes for interesting conflicts. I hope that it will. Only that it doesn't threaten us with Bosnian civil war. In America today, it seems to me, vulnerable individuals without communal support are more worrisome than the communities that might support them. I'm going to stop there because they're doing inventory in the store tonight, and they will be closing at 9, and so it would be nice to have as much time as possible for conversation or argument. You're asked by the people from C-SPAN to be sure to use the microphone, which is right here. Jerry, should I recognize people? Okay. Yes. Go ahead. You have to go to the mic.
I recall hearing you at the CUNY auditorium early this spring, I believe. You had a packed audience, and I noticed there were several people from Brooklyn, including myself, and I wanted to be understood here in this kind of flimsy crowd that people in Brooklyn do more than mourn the loss of the Dodgers and Ebbets Field. But anyway, the question I have, in Bertrand Russell's book, Conquest of Happiness, he cites William Blake as an example par excellence of the person who does not fear public opinion. And he says he was great since he never doubted that he was right and his critics wrong. Now we know that Blake did not ever act on that in any kind of violent way. What is the nature of the mentality of a Blake as opposed to the mentality of other intolerant groups who believe that their beliefs are like Blake's, in fact, right and wrong? Okay?
I'm not quite sure that I understand the question, but it is just the last part.
I was saying, what is it in the nature of the psychology, let us say, of a Blake who is convinced of the absolute rightness of his beliefs, but does not act upon it in a way which causes social chaos, and that of other people or groups who believe too that their views are right, but which do act in ways which create social dissension, social chaos?
Yes. Well, I'm a political theorist, not a psychologist, and I'm not sure I can provide you with an account of the kind of psychological structures that enable people to simultaneously be sure that they are right and tolerant of other people. But I can say something about the political arrangements that make it possible for people sure of their right, that make it impossible for people sure of their rightness to persecute others. And those are a structure of state-enforced rights. Now, I'm very interested in the question whether toleration is dependent intellectually now on the conviction that we might be wrong. Is it possible to be sure of oneself and still tolerant? I'm inclined to think it is, and that in fact there are now, since the establishment of political toleration in the 17th century, there are many examples of passionately committed religious groups, for example, which have coexisted in peace with equally passionately committed but very differently committed religious and secular groups. But still, it does help if one has a slight touch of intellectual humility. There is a famous moment in the history of toleration in the Christian world. During the English Revolution of the 1640s, Oliver Cromwell was approached by a group of Presbyterian ministers who wanted to establish whatever the Protestant version of an inquisition would have been into British mores and manners. And he looked at them and he said, "Think ye in the bowels of Christ that ye might be wrong." Now, that's an appeal to humility, in this case Christian humility, but it has a transcendent quality. But the truth is that Presbyterian ministers with exactly those beliefs did accommodate themselves to a regime of toleration in across the ocean in America, a little unwillingly, and with a few nasty incidents here and there in the early history of New England. But they did accommodate themselves without giving up the certainty of rightness. And that it's a matter that requires political arrangements of a certain sort. We can't wait for psychological transformations.
I don't know if I can do this. I can't help wondering how you fit somebody like Jesse Helms, let's say, into this scheme, because for all his flagrant individualism, he does, in a sense, represent a group, historically and probably still existing, or the Christian right, which, it's true, doesn't create a Bosnia, but can do a great deal of damage and doesn't seem to show much toleration.
Yes, okay, when I call America a radically individualist society, and indeed it is the most individualist society in human history, I don't mean to say that there are no groups. There are many groups. Americans belong to, I think there are 200,000 voluntary associations that have been counted by those sociologists who count. And that's very, very impressive. But if you're a member of very many of those groups, you know how precarious they are because they have no disciplinary mechanisms. They can't collect taxes. They can't enforce any kind of coherence on their organizations. We have a strong tradition of voluntary association, but also a very strong tradition of the splitting, fragmenting, and dissolution of voluntary associations. Now, the specific worry that I mean to describe about dissociated individuals isn't that they will stay dissociated. I mean, I do think that a large number of the people who don't vote, who express feelings of apathy and alienation and general hostility toward political institutions and leaders, are people who are cut off from the usual forms of familial and communal support. But I don't think those people can be depended on to stay out there in the world of dissociation. And my inclination is to think that dissociated individuals are material for nasty associations, for right-wing militias, for various sorts of nationalist and chauvinist revivals, for religious fundamentalism. And that's why I think we need a political program that aims at strengthening those groups that accept democratic values. And, well, somebody has to ask me, but I would like to talk about how that might be done.
I think the question that's being begged is, what is the mechanism for strengthening these groups? And then please walk us through the steps that would lead to the development of identity, then meat and potatoes. Why does this work?
Okay, that's the question I was asking for. I think we might best begin by looking at those groups in American society which are strong and which run the most and which have the thickest institutional life. And those are chiefly religious or ethnic religious communities, which are able to run hospitals and nursing homes and daycare centers and schools and family services of all sorts. And the three strongest are the Catholic, Lutheran, and Jewish communities. I suspect Irish and Italian Catholic are the strongest within the Catholic community. Among the Lutherans, it's the more specifically ethnically identified German and Scandinavian Lutherans in the Middle West who run an extraordinary welfare society inside the American welfare state. It's as if they were all good social democrats and knew just what to do out there in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and the Jews, who are simultaneously an ethnic and religious group. And we recently gained some new insight into how these groups do it. Of course, they are more cohesive than other communities. They are able, because of their cohesiveness, to collect resources from their members. They have very good fundraising apparatuses, all three. But that's not the key to their success. When the Republicans started cutting the welfare budget after the '94 election, the loudest cries went up from those three communities because their institutional structures, the hospitals, daycare centers, nursing homes, etc., are radically dependent on tax money. And this is so even though they are, all of them, religious communities. Between 55 and 65%, and it's mostly closer to the higher number, of the money spent by Catholic charities and by the Lutheran charities and by the Jewish federations is tax money, not money raised. The rest of it comes from their own communities. But close to 2/3 of it comes from the public till. So these so-called private religious communities are in fact part of the American welfare state, and probably among the better parts of the American welfare state. Now that suggests to me that we need to ask why it is that other communities and other groups are not able to collect resources on the same scale. And it's a matter of political strength and of what we might think of as sociological experience and competence. And those can be learned. Political strength can be won, and the competences can be learned. There is no reason why Black Baptist churches should not, with a little help from the government, be running welfare institutions on the same scale as Lutherans in Minnesota. And that it would change America if there were many, many more communities of that kind. They don't all have to be religious communities. Maybe the AFL-CIO could run hospitals and nursing homes, mobilizing its own members and mobilizing and gaining access to federal money. Now, those kinds of institutions are crucial to the maintenance and reproduction of a culture. You need to be able to provide life cycle services for your members if you are to survive as a group. And so we have to make it possible for all of the groups that constitute American multiculturalism to do that. And life cycle services, it's important to realize that the wall between church and state doesn't exist in these institutions. A Jewish nursing home will get 60% of its money from the federal government, but it will run a kosher kitchen, and it will celebrate the Jewish holidays, and it will bring in a rabbi on the Sabbath. And a Lutheran nursing home will have Bible classes in the Lutheran style, and will bring in Lutheran ministers, and will celebrate the Christian calendar. Now, if you take federal money, you've got to be open to anybody who wants to come in, and that's an important requirement of a liberal and tolerant regime. But if someone who's not Christian comes into a Lutheran nursing home, they're going to have to make their peace with the Christian calendar. And if someone comes into a Jewish nursing home who isn't Jewish, they're going to have to make their peace with the kosher kitchen. So we have opened holes in the wall between church and state, and they seem to me to be useful holes. And this way of organizing welfare services, which now exists almost exclusively among religious groups, but could conceivably be extended beyond religious groups, seems to me to provide a paradigm of how you sustain life services with a cultural inflection, life services of a particular kind, within the framework of a liberal welfare state, using the tax powers of that state. Here, then.
I was interested in your specification of the Catholic, Lutheran, and Jewish communities as having strong group power and bases. And I was wondering how you relate that to, say, Louis Farrakhan and his Muslim movement that really is advocating that same sort of power group politics. And it seems to me, just as an objective observer, that a lot of the criticism that his group gets isn't because of his hate-mongering so-called, but because he is advocating a strong economic power base for a lot of black Americans, and I think there are people who just can't deal with that. So I'd like for you to talk to that, please.
Okay, well, I disagree with the premise. I think that were there a Nation of Islam or a unified Black Baptist church community that tried to organize hospitals and nursing homes and so on the same scale. This already happens, but on the same scale as Lutherans and Jews, they would have the same access to federal funds. And I think what destroys Farrakhan is precisely the hate-mongering. What makes him politically, what makes him a political disaster for the black community is the deliberate cultivation of anti-toleration attitudes.
Can I just make a follow-up comment?
Yeah, sure.
I just want to personally disagree with the term black community because I hear it bandied about all the time, and I'd like for somebody to tell me where and who the black community is, considering there are black Lutherans, black Catholics, black Jews. So just as that starting point, it's a stupid term, and I find it very offensive, and I think it's a problematical way of thinking about race and toleration in this country.
Well, the whole point of my talk was that all of these communities are divided, pluralistic, and that was the main theme of my talk. Nonetheless, the Jewish federations, to take an example, stand a little bit above the Reform and the Conservative and the Orthodox congregations, which are bitterly divided, and raise money that is spent across the community. And it's not impossible that black organizations could arise to function in the same way. But I certainly appreciate the point that it's a central feature of our society that communities are divided. That's what makes it so important to find ways of well, let me put it a different way. These religious communities have sustained themselves for a very long time without the kind of state support that I'm now advocating, for hundreds of years. So why do they need it now? Victorian England was full of voluntary associations and self-help organizations without state support. So why now? And the answer is precisely because of the vociferous and centrifugal tendencies and the radical individualism of American life that make it so much harder to sustain these kinds of group identities and and to reproduce a culture than it used to be. The religious communities that sustained themselves over centuries did so with the power to tithe their members. The ethnic communities and the working class self-help organizations derive from strong, cohesive neighborhoods where people lived closely together and where the social pressure to join in common projects was much, much stronger than anything that any groups can mobilize in America today. And that's why, if we want to sustain group life, there are people who don't want to, but if we do want to, then we're going to have to find ways of subsidizing it from the outside. I recognize, yes, this person, please, first, and then you.
Professor Walzer, I'll try to make a brief question on some very wide thoughts you've raised. And they come from the perspective of two words, market and mosaic. Market, recent experience in England, seeing the reaction that The Economist, for example, had to Amitai Etzione's proposals about communitarianism. I was quite shocked to find how radical they thought he was. Mosaic, because in a different perspective, in traveling in Canada recently, I reflected that George Woodcock addresses something similar to what you're saying, in saying that Canadians are inherently, in their history, a mosaic of groups. Americans have a legacy of melting pot, and perhaps the market is the fire under the melting pot to a great extent. Mm-hmm. How would you differentiate what you were proposing from, say, a critique that said you were proposing that Americans become more like Canadians?
Well, I think the tradition that you've identified as a mosaic, which is the multiculturalist or cultural pluralist tradition, has in fact always had a significant presence in American life. My book before On Toleration was called What It Means to Be an American. And I drew very heavily on the work of Horace Callan, an American Jewish political theorist, social philosopher of the teens and 20s, who wrote against the melting pot in defense of cultural pluralism as the American model, in defense of America as a nation of nationalities. More recently, the Harvard political philosopher Jack Rawls has called America a social union of social unions. That means that the state is a kind of framework within which we have a multitude of more and less differentiated cultural, religious, ethnic, political groups. And it may be that the nation of nationalities, the social union of social unions, is just a way station on the road to an all-American, unified, homogeneous identity. If immigration stopped, which it isn't going to, but if immigration stopped and if the melting pot, if the fires of the melting pot roared, and if the pervasive weakness of groups that I've described continued, it might be that we would move toward a far more homogeneous society. But there's a lot of resistance in this country, as in Canada, and there's a lot of resistance even without the Quebecer phenomenon, because the French in Quebec have a homeland. It's really a European-style nationalism. But in this country, unless something happens in the Southwest, in this country, all of the immigrants have dispersed, and we don't have a Quebec. We don't have a Kurdistan or a Slovenia. But despite that, there's enormous resistance to melting. It may be our ultimate future. I'm suggesting, I mean to support the resistance, which is, I suppose, you could say it would make us more like Canada. On the other hand, I think the nation of nationalities has deep American roots. Yes.
Yes. To what degree do you think the new media, such as the internet, will play in bringing about the new media, such as like the internet, will play in strengthening like voluntary groups and bringing about toleration?
Yeah, I'm afraid you've asked the wrong person. I'm not an inhabitant of that new world. And I find it very difficult to speculate on its consequences. There are people who think it will strengthen differentiation because it makes it possible. It makes instant communication between people who want to communicate with one another. It makes instant communication possible. On the other hand, we don't really know what the long-term social effects of non-face-to-face instant communication are going to be like. This is a radically new experience. How close do people get on the internet? I can't answer that question, but somewhere down the road there will be graduate students writing theses on that topic. Yes. Here.
I'm just wondering if, like, this weakening of group identity that you're talking about, isn't it somewhat inevitable when you have as strong an individualism as we have here? I mean, people today are choosing to be another culture or choosing to be many cultures. And if you go to great lengths to try to strengthen these groups, won't some of that freedom to choose be taken away because they'll feel under pressure to conform to the group, say, they're raised in or born in? And so you won't be able to be a Jewish kid from Queens who can choose to be a Rastafarian, something like that, because the pressure will be that much greater.
Right. Right. There is a there is a trade-off between the more radical forms of individualism and the strength of groups. But it's a very complicated trade-off, because if you follow my argument, the weakening of groups is going to make individual choice less and less meaningful. I once had a debate with a Harvard sociologist named Orlando Patterson, who'd written a book called, I think, Ethnic Chauvinism. It was an attack on all the forms of identity politics, national, international, on nationalism and religious orthodoxy and all of it. And we had a public debate in Cambridge about 15 or more years ago. And he described himself as a cosmopolitan. That's the choice he'd made. He was born in Jamaica. And he'd lived in London and then in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he had continued to be involved in Jamaican politics as an advisor to the socialist prime minister, and also involved in London. And he traveled to other parts of the world, and he thought, rightly, that this was a good life, and that cosmopolitan capacity to be at home in many different places and to enjoy the cultures of different places, he thought was the ideal. And in responding to him, I argued that it was indeed a very attractive life that he had, but that his ability to move from one place to another was parasitical on the willingness of other people to sit still in those particular places, like Jamaica and England and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and to give those places the distinctive character that he could visit and enjoy. And without those people who sat still, who made a commitment to a particular place and a particular culture, his ability to pick and choose wouldn't exist. If the whole world was the same, then you couldn't live the life that he thought was the ideal life. So I think there is both a tension between individuality and community, but also a necessary correlation between them. You remember or you may not remember the Ogden Nash song about the Englishman who would go out in the noonday sun And that was a kind of the paradigm of an English character, shaped by generations of Protestant stiff upper lip English upbringing. Well, encountered outside of England, that character seemed a quintessential individual, quirky and strong-minded and willful, but he was the product of a culture. And it's hard to imagine people like that producing themselves. One more question. Okay.
Just wanted to get back to the mechanisms which you would endorse to support the kind of social groups that you think are important. And you seem to limit yourself to deputizing non-political but social groups within communities, like religious groups or community groups. And you used, or you cited as your reason for that, or you alluded to it, that it was really the only thing that's permissible in a liberal regime, that the government perhaps can't get involved in that. I'm not sure if that's what you meant. But it seems to me that if those groups are relying on government support in some fashion through taxation, that's still going to draw the same criticisms that a more robust political action would warrant.
What are the criticisms?
For instance, that the government doesn't have a right to intervene in debates about the good life or things of that nature, but that if you're taking money from taxpayers, that you're still going to have to answer that question.
Yes, I assume, yes, it's not a hard question for me.
But then why wouldn't you, why wouldn't more robust political action be in order than just tax support? Why wouldn't the government be able to actually intervene in some of these things?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by intervene. If the government only gives tax money, say, to a Catholic or Jewish nursing home which is prepared to take in non-Catholics and non-Jews, then it is intervening, because the old world forms of Catholicism and Judaism weren't open in that way. It is imposing certain liberal norms when it gives its money. And I think the government also has to act directly, because of the inequalities of groups, and because everybody isn't picked up by these different groups. The government has to provide services directly. And I think it would be a very good thing if the labor movement, as it did in Europe in the high days of social democracy, were to try to provide services of these sorts, and to celebrate its holidays and remember its history in its own institutions. So I think that I'm not troubled by the thought that the government is playing a role. The pluralism that I've described is entirely consistent with American liberal democracy. But I'm also not opposed to the Norwegian government, which is not an immigrant society. Norway is a nation state. And I think in Norway, it's perfectly appropriate for the public schools to teach Norwegian history and literature, and to try to inculcate Norwegianness, so long as they allow the Macedonian guest workers to form their own voluntary associations and to run their own organizations. But I don't find anything wrong with the government of a nation state having a conception that it's a good thing to be Norwegian, and organizing its institutional life to reproduce Norwegianness across generations. That seems to me to be entirely justifiable. There are many ways of sustaining tolerant regimes. I was trying to describe the ways most appropriate to an immigrant society like our own.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the audience for a wonderful conversation. You came prepared with questions, it almost seems. If anybody would like to get their book signed, please come up to the table, go back and come up to the table around the front here, and don't charge forward. Thank you very much.
So we do have to get at it.
Oh, no, we have
means that you think you're better than the others, but you
No,
want to others live.
no, I don't think that's what it means. I mean, that's one thing. That's one meaning, but it's not the. It's not the.
New York Times Orthodox Jewish female student says she can't live in Yale's dorms because they're mixed men and women, and she feels this is promiscuous. She's not asking to impose her values, but she just wants to live at home the way her brother did before they had this wacko requirement that everyone has to live in the same dorm. How can I combat that without taking off the entire Orthodox Jewish style?
You can't. But I'm not sure they're wrong. These kids. Why do you think they're?
There's nothing in Jewish law that says you can't live in a dorm with men, or for that matter, study side by side with people of the opposite gender or with professors of the opposite gender. This whole sex segregation thing that has come down, I think, is just ghettoizing the Orthodox away from other Jewish groups, and it's very upsetting. I get upset, so it's hard for me to work within the structure. So I just think, here's an 18-year-old girl who says, I can't go to Yale because I have to live on an all-girl floor and there are men above and below me, and this is against my religious beliefs.
Yeah. Oh, you can certainly argue that they're wrong about Judaism, but if they, but there are so many different ways of being a Jew, and this is their way of being.
Which brings me to my question, Michael. Certainly there's a difference between toleration and acceptance.
Well,
and toleration implies a condescension.
Yeah, I don't think it always does.
Tolerate means, I'm going to let you.
Yeah,
I will permit
but
you.
the fight for religious toleration in England, the original fight, had none of those connotations. It was the God's house has many mansions. That was kind of the. And there is a kind of, if everybody has to tolerate everybody else, then there can't be condescension. If toleration takes on that kind of equality.
So why toleration and not acceptance?
Well, okay.
Tolerance, just to really be submitted.
Yeah, I use tolerance as the attitude and toleration as the political institutional arrangement.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
It's very nice to hear a theorist who is very clear on the subject of community and successful together. He's written a dissertation on the subject of community and civic virtue. It's a recurring theme in his
Hi.
Could you do 2 books, or is it?
Sure, I can do 2 books.
Are you working on the next book?
Yeah. A big collaborative project on Jewish political thought, which will be published in 3 volumes by Yale University Press, but it's probably the rest of my life before it's finished. Volume 1 is supposed to be delivered this fall.
Do you know Nancy Rosenberg?
Sure.
You do?
Yes,
She
yes.
wrote a book, or she's writing a book that's similar to this, that talks about intermediate associations.
Uh-huh.
Societies.
Yes. Nancy was in one of the first classes I taught at Harvard, and
Really?
yeah.
She was a student there, right?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's really nice meeting you. Thank you.
I saw you give a lecture 2 years ago at London School of Economics, and the subject of the day was headscarves in France.
Uh-huh.
Now it's in America. You made the point. In America, you made the point that there's no threat of balkanization because no ethnic group nation has a territorial homeland. This is like kind of a or a territorial base. But in Europe, the threat of regionalism is very real. Would you still have like a universal respect for regional or...
I think I missed by one day. Well, I don't think there is a single. The whole argument of the book is that there are many different regimes of toleration, and I don't think the immigrant society model is going to work in Spain or in Italy. You need other patterns, and what the Spaniards are working toward, which is a kind of autonomy for Catalan and the Basque territory, or what the British are trying in Scotland, I think we shouldn't do that with Utah, but I think for Scotland it's appropriate. Yeah. Well, there are political risks in every move, and in Scotland there's an ancient nationalist movement, but the Labour Party the Labour Party doesn't believe that it is dissolving the United Kingdom. So,
the other party does that. What do you think?
I think not.
Because?
Well, it's going to be a test of how British the Scots are. But I would guess that the ties are strong enough to withstand this kind of devolution, and that the Brits will get credit for. Now, I don't know. But would it be so terrible if the United Kingdom became, or if Spain became, a federation? I mean,
terrible for who?
Well, I mean, Catalan culture is very old. Why not?
That you won't be able to sustain itself without Catalan taxpayers.